Die Sprachübertragung beginnt jetzt. Alle Teilnehmer befinden sich im Zuhörermodus.
Welcome to today's webinar about Singapore. My name is Frank Jura and I'm the General Manager at Sterling in Germany. About today's webinar, we've planned about roughly 30 minutes for this session. The content of this webinar will be available afterwards on www.sterlingrelocation.com. We will send you the links too. Please assist us in improving our webinars. Directly after the session, you have the ability to give us your feedback. Also, after the session, it will be possible to ask questions, and we will unmute you therefore. About Sterling. Sterling, we deliver relocation management services in more than 120 countries. Our service portfolio includes, but is not limited to, visa and immigration services, the full range of relocation services, and expense management as well. More than 220 dedicated employees in 12 offices worldwide take care of our clients. In 2013, we have worked for more than 400 corporate clients. We served them with more than 11,700 services in 120 countries. We are proud of our satisfaction score, which is 98.6%, and this is high above the average in this industry. Your presenter today is Radhika Gorsia. She's the General Manager of our APAC office at Sterling. She moved to Singapore from London with her husband and her 2 sons in December 2012. And now she will give you facts about Singapore, as well as some insights of her experience when relocating there. I hand over to Radhika now. Thank you, Radhika.
Hello, everybody. My name is Radhika Gorsia. I've worked for Sterling for over 14 years. When this opportunity came up to go and work in our Singapore office, it was very hard to turn down. Also taking into consideration the ages of our children, it just seemed to be the perfect timing to work in Singapore and explore Southeast Asia for a few years. What I'm going to talk to you today is a little bit about my experience moving across over to Singapore, and obviously what helps the assignees when you're thinking about moving them over, and the nice to have and the questions that you don't always get, straight hand unless you've actually been through the process yourself. What we're going to do is I'm going to just give you a brief overview about the common parts of moving to a new location. Just the introduction about Singapore, international schools, the foreign domestic workers, and any other information that I think would be really relevant for you to have considered when you're thinking about sending somebody across. So, Singapore. There has recently been some contradictory evidence about Singapore and the cost of living data, which was given through The Economist, which announced that Singapore was the most expensive city in the world, while Mercer released cost of living data that ranked Singapore as the 5th most expensive in the world. So the data regarding this and the discrepancy was really around the use of cars and vehicle allowances. So I would just ask you to check to make sure that whichever data you're looking at, you take into consideration what that includes and doesn't include, because there is contradictory evidence out there in terms of the cost of living data on Singapore. So a few facts about Singapore. The population of Singapore is 5.3 million. Like most tropical islands in the world, the weather can change very quickly. It can turn from blue skies to sunshine to torrential downpour within a very short span of time. Unless you've actually been to Singapore, you wouldn't realize the actual scale of Singapore. So if you go from one side of Singapore to the other, it's actually only 26 miles. You can drive around the whole of Singapore within half a day, and 40 minutes from one side of Singapore to another. And also you could be within Malaysia within 25 minutes. When you look at the size of Singapore here, what you don't realize is, if you look at the bit where the mouse is at the moment, that is really Singapore's central business district, and you can be anywhere within Singapore within 40 minutes of the Singapore district. Just a general area orientation. So Singapore is basically done around districts, and the districts are from the central business district to where the most expats live as well. So what I've done here, if you look at the areas in red, that is pretty much where the expats and the assignees tend to live, and they're normally around really good train links straight into the central business district or around the central business district. A lot of assignees with children tend to go through to the East Coast. If you look here, that's mainly the East Coast, and that I would say is probably a 20 to 25 minute commute into the central business district. There's also lots of the north and the west area, which, you know, there are some expats, but it's not really where they tend to segregate when they're looking for places to live. So, you know, just like every other assignee, when we started to research areas in Singapore for us to live in as a family, we did the normal thing of going on onto the internet, seeing what we could get for our, you know, for our price range. Most assignees always seem to stretch the top end of their budgets and then sign a 2-year contract thinking that they're going to be living outside of the city. As I said, you don't really know the scale of Singapore until you're actually there. Within a very short time of arriving, it became very clear that nowhere in Singapore is very far, and the space within a 30-minute commute to the central business district in Singapore gives you far more space, and it's much greater than what you get when you go into the more city areas. By this time, it's usually too late to change your mind. Typically, there are 2-year contracts that are signed, and it's very hard to break them unless you're cancelling your pass and being terminated by your employer, in which case you can then invoke the diplomatic clause, which allows you to break the contract. But other than that, it's a 2-year lease, so even if you wanted to move, it's very difficult then later on to decide that you're happy to move unless you then find somebody else to take over your lease and then do the negotiations with the landlord. So it is possible, but it's just that little bit more difficult, really. Of course, you can have a copy of the presentation later in terms of the expat areas and that. So in terms of housing in Singapore, it is very much condominium style living. With the size, given the size of the island, the city is built vertically. So most housing is condominiums and can go easily up to 50 floors. As a family, we chose to live on the 26th floor despite my husband having a fear of heights. Mainly because, you know, houses and landed properties are very rare to come by, and, you know, when they are, they're actually much more expensive. One of the tallest condominiums at the moment stands at 71 floors high. You know, but the positive side of the condominiums is that most of them do come with, you know, on-site facilities, a swimming pool, a gym, tennis courts, and some with small children's playground areas as well. But also what it does is when you're moving to a brand new country, it makes life easier to make friends and meet people as well, because you'll all, you know, be around the pool at the weekends and that. So it does really help in terms of that. Now, in terms of housing, and just give you an overview of the general market practice, Singapore is a realtor's market. So, you know, even when you have your agents that will be showing you around, it really is, you know, all the properties are put through the realtor's market. When you go through the realtor, you will be required to pay 2 months deposit and 1 month's rental. And for a landlord to agree to give you that property, a letter of what's called an LOI, letter of intent, must be signed, which is when you release your holding deposit. So when that happens, you may want to think about the provisions that are in place for the assignees, especially if they're local hires. With rents being so high in Singapore, that could easily be, you know, a $30,000 upfront payment just for a 2-bedroom apartment. So I really would think about, you know, what most companies do is maybe pay it on behalf of the assignee, and then do a clawback of 6 to 12 months on the salary just to help them once they first get there for the 3 months rent that they have to pay. Also, what's worth knowing is any rent that's under $4,000 per month, the commission, which is normally 1 month's commission, is to be paid by the tenant. Whereas typically rent above $4,000 per month, the commission will be paid by the landlord. So again, that's an added fee that you need to really think about that may come on to play in that. Also, in terms of sizing, especially when you compare it to Europe, the condominiums are much smaller in terms of sizing. Assignees tend to come to Singapore, wanting the big living area, the big space. And I don't think, until you're living there, how difficult it is to actually, the more space that you have, the higher bills, and mainly air conditioning bills. So these properties are made slightly smaller to then, of course, be more affordable in terms of, trying to keep the place cool. Singapore being a tropical island, the temperatures range between 25 to 32 degrees every single day of the year. There are no seasons whatsoever. So your air conditioning will be on 365 days a year. So it's just something to take into consideration. I've pulled together also just to give you an idea of the prices of rentals in Singapore and the areas. So the main district, which is obviously the Orchard area, and that is probably the most expensive part of Singapore, where a 4-bedroom apartment could very easily set you back between $13,000 to 21,000 Singapore dollars a month. And I would say that is probably a 10 to 15-minute commute straight into the central business district. However, if you went through to the River Valley district, which is districts 9 or 15 and 16, which are obviously also very, places where expats do tend to congregate, you get, a slightly more for your money in terms of that and more living space. But happy to send this across for you to have a look at in more detail. Now, in terms of international schools, there are a high number of international schools in Singapore, and they seem to be increasing year on year. This year alone, there's 3 new schools that are opening in August. So just to give you, some scale in terms of how much international schools are utilized in Singapore. As a family, having 2 children of our own, we were pretty adamant that we wanted our boys, being British, to attend a British school and remain in the British curriculum. However, there are only 2 British schools in Singapore, and at that point, Tanglin Trust and Dover Court. Tanglin Trust had a waiting list of over 2.5 years, as did Dover Court, although they were able to give a space for one of my sons, but not the other. So we were a little bit stuck, to be honest, because, with that being the case, we had no choice. We couldn't come, if that's what we wanted, we couldn't move to Singapore and have our children in the British curriculum without paying a ridiculous debenture of something like $130,000 to guarantee them a place. So what we did is we explored the IB program, which is the most recognized international baccalaureate program in Singapore and is offered by the majority of the international schools. We spoke to schools both in the UK and in Singapore because we wanted to learn the effect that the IB program would have on our boys, because we did look at this as maybe a 2 to 3 year plan and then go back to the UK. And so we did learn that actually the IB program is a very interchangeable, for the UK and most other European countries as well. And given the age of our boys, they could easily go back into the British curriculum up until a certain age. That decision then opened up a lot more choices for us. We enrolled our son Jay into OFS, which is the Overseas Family School. And to be honest, we did that originally until a space became available. for him in one of the other schools. But actually, he was so happy there and made so many good friends that we just decided to leave him there as well. The other popular schools in Singapore is obviously the Singapore American School and then the Stanford American School, and they both offer IB programs as well. The popular British schools is Tangley Trust and then Dulwich College, which opens August 14th this year as well. Okay, going on to another big part of Singapore is the foreign domestic workers. Now, foreign domestic workers, there are approximately 214,500 foreign domestic workers in Singapore. And this is just very different to, you know, Europe, where you can get help in terms of nannies and that, but not live-in helpers, which is very, very common in Singapore. So, you know, when we first, you know, when people knew that we were going to Singapore, they would make comments, oh, wow, you're going to be so lucky, you're going to get to have, you know, some live-in help, especially with the kids and the ages of them. And it is, you know, it's very, very helpful, but there are things that you must take into consideration, you know, about foreign domestic helpers, even though that, you know, they're very common, everybody has them, especially if, you know, both parents, both spouses are working. And they're, you know, very affordable as well within Singapore. They prefer to work with Western families as well. So in terms of, you know, having the people that you want or that you would trust with your family and your children, you know, there are so many to choose from, but getting it right is obviously the main part. And the salaries do vary. They vary from between 400 Singapore dollars to 700 Singapore dollars per month, and that really is dependent on experience and their length of time in Singapore. You can easily get a helper for $400 a month, but it would probably be somebody that's just come into Singapore. So the things that you need to bear in mind is, you know, you and your family have just moved to Singapore, to then get somebody else orientated around Singapore, how the train system works, how the bus system works, how to get from one place to another. You know, that is all just added stress to the family. So, you know, we went for somebody that already lived in Singapore that actually could help us get around Singapore as and when we needed to. Also, there's a monthly levy of $265 a month to the Ministry of Manpower. The other thing to remember about foreign domestic workers is that you as an assignee or your assignees are 100% accountable for them. They have their work permits and their visas based on having an employment contract with either you as an assignee or your assignees. So, you know, it is down to the assignee to make sure that there is proper healthcare plan in place, because, you know, in Singapore there is no government healthcare. Everybody has to have their own healthcare plan. They're also entitled to a home visit once every 2 years, which needs to be paid for as well. And the government, Ministry of Manpower, do make sure that they have to have 6 monthly checks, and all of this is really down to the assignees and the families to arrange and organize. I mean, you know, people do refer to it as it is like having another child. You are absolutely responsible for that helper. You set their daily routines, you even set their curfews in terms of what time. And that is just something in the, you know, in the UK we're just not used to, you know, that way of living. Just a couple of things to take into consideration when you do opt for a domestic worker is that you must attend a training course in order to hire one, and that is either a one-day training course or you can do it online, which approximately takes 3 hours or so. We moved on to Singapore immigration. So just to give you a really brief overview, the 3 main immigration passes that assignees tend to come over on is the employment pass, the dependence pass, or long-term visit passes. The majority of the, you know, what they would need is either the monthly salary or a university degree. It's, I think, one or the other. and all the work experience. Everything in Singapore is actually very, very process driven. So an application process for an employment pass really only takes 7 days and can get done through online. Once the assignee has the employment pass, then the spouse and the children will then be entitled to a dependence pass. What can also happen, or if it's a long-term visitor's pass, but if then the spouse seeks employment, they can easily switch from a dependence pass into having their own employment passes. If you have any questions on Singapore immigration, please feel free to give us an email and we'll help you with any requirements. Moving on to the Singapore health system, the World Care Health Organization did rank Singapore's healthcare system as the 6th overall in the World Healthcare Report. So it's a very efficient healthcare system. You know, but there are things that you do need to take into consideration. You know, all expats, all families, whether they're on local contracts and not being subsidized by the company, you do have to make sure you have sufficient healthcare insurance. So even if your company is not paying for it, what I would suggest is maybe you can put them in touch with, you know, your company's healthcare and make sure that they really do have the sufficient healthcare that they need. You know, whilst routine doctor's visits or consultations are very inexpensive, ranging between 15 to 30 Singapore dollars for a visit, when you start going into the specialist consultations, that's when it really does get quite expensive. And most covers do not include outpatient. So unlike the UK, which I'm comparing to, because obviously that's what I know, whereas a doctor would just write you a referral letter and that would get covered through your insurance, it's really not the same here. You know, until there is a major accident or you are hospitalized, if you don't have outpatient care, none of that will be covered at all. The other thing that, especially if you're a young family, or a couple thinking about having children, most insurance companies will not cover for pregnancy, and if they do, it's only effective from 10 months after the commencement date of the policy, so you do need to check that very carefully, because uncomplicated maternity packages within Singapore range from $8,000 to $12,000. Just to have a baby. Once there's complications, you know, that could go into the 30, 40,000s very easily. So I would absolutely recommend that that is taken into consideration. Just in terms of some comparisons for pricing around the world, you know, the one thing that's actually very reasonably priced in Singapore is taxis. And if you look at it in comparison to some of the main cities in the rest of the world, and these are all from the airport to the actual city areas, you know, Singapore's pricing of, you know, $14.40, which, you know, equates to around 7 or 8 euros, you know, £8, is actually very reasonable. Because driving a car in Singapore is so expensive and the license is to have a car, most assignees actually opt not to have and drive cars because, you know, getting around in taxis and trains and buses is so efficient in Singapore. But when you consider that to London, okay, it's double the distance, but it's, you know, definitely 4 or 5 times the size of a taxi course. Then just moving on to, you know, what would be a comparison without the Big Mac meal. As you can see here, you know, Singapore $3.60 is actually cheaper than the original US in terms of that, with India being the lowest really in pricing for the Big Mac meal. And then this really just gives you an idea of how much growth and infrastructure changes have taken place in Singapore since the 1960s to 2014. I mean, it is, you know, it is a great place to live and work, and it's gone through a lot of infrastructure change. But You know, most families, certainly my family and families that I know, once they come to Singapore, life is, you know, is very easy. Everybody speaks English. The weather is fantastic. It's the gateway to the rest of Southeast Asia. So I would say, you know, most families are actually very sad when it comes to having to leave Singapore. And then lastly, this is for the women out there, what nobody really tells you about moving to a destination with high humidity. Thousands and thousands of dollars are spent on hair straightening and relaxing and conditioning treatments just due to the high humidity in the country. I hope you found that very informative. Oop, I've lost my questions. I'm very sorry. But if you've got any questions, please, I think we're going to unmute the phones and see.
Are there any questions? So I think there are no questions. Just in case if something comes up, we will, of course, more than happy to answer the questions. If you send us an email later after this session, we will disclose the contact details. So yeah, please feel free to contact us anytime for questions. Yeah, thank you for your attendance. Thank you, Radhika, for your great insights of Singapore. And I hope that this was useful for you, and hope to see you in one of the webinars soon. Thank you very much, and have a great day.